Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. Today, we are covering a pair of gear curiosities out of the Boss Micro Rack series, the RPQ-10 Parametric EQ and RCL-10 Compressor, Limiter, and Noise Gate. This video sort of serves as a new tour of Tube Amp Central Command. Some of you that have viewed the channel in the past couple of years might remember seeing this in several different forms in the background and now set atop this Jet City 2x12. But the general idea of this now 6U rack, started out as a 12U, but just ended up not needing a whole lot of that space, is to make playing through my tube amplifier collection much more manageable, both in the room and for direct silent recording applications, whether I'm, recording demo ideas or actually recording an album or just doing pedal demos, that sort of thing. And the idea for this entire rack, besides being able to select amplifier and cabinet combinations and route different signal paths very easily with this patch bay, which again is kind of in flux, is to have a dry system, kind of an all-in-one thing that does everything from, the bass amplifier tone to slight modifications that don't necessarily intrude on that sound, but just kind of perfect it depending on what I'm doing. And that is where this micro preamp and compressor slash limiter slash noise gate comes in. So sitting atop this Furman power supply, which I don't think is quite interesting enough to cover in its own video, so we're going to skip that one, is indeed a pair of Boss Micro Rack modules. And some of you might have seen these out on Reverb or eBay. They're getting a little harder to find, and quite frankly, I think they're getting to the point of being too expensive to really recommend. These things, I think, are among the two, well, I guess the compressor and limiter are really one of the more common ones. The parametric preamp was kind of hard to track down and are now running north of $150 US. Used to, I remember even as short as a couple years ago seeing these things just, out there for $80 or less. But I guess some of the collectors have gotten their grubby hands on them because they're becoming harder and harder to find. Now, you can be a total loser like myself and have some number of micro rack modules that's divisible by 2, and you can buy this Roland rack adapter where you can put one on each side, and it serves my purposes fine, and I think it looks really nice. But if you want to be the ultimate collector, there's actually a half-width Boss rack that you screw all these into, and I think you can fit like 4 or 5 at a time. So you need multiple to span the entire collection, which includes stuff like digital delay, digital reverb, a chorus ensemble. One that I'd really like to get my hands on at some point is the distortion and fuzz unit, which I thought was pretty cool and almost took the place of the compressor and limiter. But considering that I have 2 pedal boards and thinking about starting a 3rd one for different distortion sounds, I thought it's probably overkill and kind of redundant. So one thing I do not have in my collection in any other facet is something like this. So that's why I ended up choosing these two for this application. Speaking of which, let's talk about why I chose these units and how I have them wired in my setup. Admittedly, this is not going to be the most in-depth look at these pieces of gear because I'm using them only in a guitar application. You could very well chain these even in a stereo configuration. There's like a stereo link if you have like two of these compressor and limiters. You could use them on a balanced line source. If you have like a microphone mixer you want to run through these, you could very well do that. These are studio tools. They do have some drawbacks, at least in the way that I'm using them, that would probably prevent me from using them in any other application besides a stringed instrument. And additionally, I have them wired in series and it's not reversible. So I have the Parametric EQ running directly into the compressor here, not the other way around. There's a reason for that, and I guess any other circumstance, if this did not have a noise gate, I'd probably go the other way around. But either way, I think it works pretty well. And because I can't exactly easily access the rear of these units, I have the input going to this jack on a patch bay and the output of this one going to here. So it's pretty easy to plug an instrument directly in and take that one out, plug it directly to an amplifier or whatever source I'm using. If you wanted to use these in a live scenario, you very well could. There is a foot switch jack on the rear as well, or you could be lazy and just turn the effect on and off in a studio environment. Though the way I have this set up, pretty much leave them on all the time and just don't use that in my patch bay if I don't want that in my signal path, which I would recommend because of some noise and level concerns I have. But overall, I think they sound really great, and I'm glad I went with them. So for the RPQ-10 in particular, there is a graphic EQ, and I did, of course, consider that. I did not go with that for a couple reasons. One, I already have the Boss GE7, so a 10-band version of that general idea, a little overkill for my setup in particular. B, I would be more inclined to use graphic EQ in the loop, given its behavior. And C, I really like the idea of a dual band parametric EQ in front of an amplifier, because the way a lot of us, especially high gain players, use boost pedals, it can really be accomplished with a simple EQ VST or indeed a parametric EQ. And, some of you might look at this and scoff and think, well, you got a high control, low control, and an output level. How useful can this really be? Well, let's say you like the sound of a tube screamer, but perhaps through one of your amplifiers or using one of your guitars, it's just a little too honky or takes away too much bass, and you're not going to use the gain control anyway, so you're not really getting any dirt off of it. Well, enter a parametric EQ. With something like this, we can keep all the bass content if we want. We can selectively roll off some if we want to as well, change the bandwidth in doing so. We can, say, apply a broadband boost somewhere between 600 and 1000 hertz up to 15 dB, in the 10 to 12 decibel region. Generally sounds pretty convincing for the tube screamer sound. And then throw on an additional up to 15 decibels of clean boost after it. And I mean, that is pretty much the high gain metal trick. Make it as subtle or as not subtle as you want. And this really replaces a lot of boutique pedals. Now, one of the drawbacks to this design, and as you'll see, it's not that big of a deal, but it is kind of easy to overload this circuit. On the input here, you have the input level control, and it will flash this LED if it's taking in too high of a signal and it's clipping the input circuitry. Likewise, the level control here will flash if you're overdriving the output, which it's gonna flash throughout most of these demos. But I'm of the mind that if it sounds good, it is good. I really don't care what those LEDs say. I don't care if it's a completely clean boost as long as it's doing what I want it to do. For a lot of this stuff, I'm going to be driving the front end of a high gain amplifier anyway. So, a little more compression and distortion never hurt anybody there as long as it sounds okay. Even if you're not a strictly high gain player though, don't overlook this kind of stuff, because rarely, at least for me, do I ever find the perfect guitar pickup and amplifier combination where I can just plug straight into it. I'm generally thinking, this is really close and it's good, but maybe this low end frequency is a little too woofy, or the single coil pickup is just a little too harsh going through here and I'd like to round it out a little bit, or this humbucker is just a little too thick and accentuating a little bit more of the high end or cutting some of the lows I think would really help cut on this amplifier. It's not necessarily a matter of how much distortion or the edge of breakup quality of an amplifier. It's just the overall image that is being projected there. And that's where a parametric EQ can really come into play. Whether you want to brighten up a dark set of humbuckers or round out a spiky sounding single coil, drive the front end of a mostly clean but slightly broken up amplifier into crunch territory, there's all kinds of stuff you could do. One of my favorite tricks that involves not boosting frequencies is to cut somewhere around the 2000 hertz region and boost the low end, overall boost the level. And for a lot of at least plexi-inspired amplifiers, I find that you can get almost a faux big muff sound out of it that I think is pretty cool. So experiment to your heart's desire. The RCL-10 is a little more utilitarian in nature, although it can be creatively fulfilling for those of you that enjoy compression. I'm not one of those people, at least when it comes to compression through an amplifier and not the other way around. It doesn't feel great to me, even the best rated compressors. I would prefer to have my Bogner Harlow, where it has some of that transformer smashed kind of sound more than squashing a signal and then raising the level afterwards. But it can sound really good. I don't particularly love the feel of this model, but for reamping applications, or if you want to drive an amplifier on the edge of breakup with a heavily compressed signal, you can get some magical results that way. This also doubles as, or triples more like it, as a limiter, as there is a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, and an infinity to 1 mode, and of course everything in between. So you want to hard limit a signal, like put it through the effects loop or you've got a synth or something that could potentially be overpowering, then you can use that in that application as well. But there's also the expansion mode with a range of up to 1 to 1.5, which is the opposite of compression for those of you that may not be used to using that kind of mode, where anything under the signal threshold will actually be reduced in level instead of the other way around. And this increases your dynamic range instead of decreases it. There's not a ton of applications for this on electric guitar. You can do some subtle enhancements if for whatever reason you really want to accentuate the transients or dynamic range of an amplifier, but generally you don't want that in a mixing application. One thing I did find that was pretty cool in the expander mode was to use like an active set of pickups and get a lot of dynamic range going through a dirty channel, where you pick softly, this expander actually lowers the level, and then you get a really close to clean chimey sound. And then when you dig in, you've got a dirty amplifier. So that can be kind of cool. But for the most part, we'll be using the compression controls there. I generally stick with the attack really fast, or, anywhere between about 9:30, 10 o'clock or under. And then release time kind of varies depending on what I'm doing. When I'm playing, I prefer attack and release really quick, but it can sound better other ways, especially for reamping. Onto the noise gate circuit then. This is pretty much, well, it's the old Boss NS2 circuit as far as I can tell. And it's honestly better than I thought it would be in here. It's not a Fort and Zool. It's not an ISP decimator by any stretch of the imagination, but it does work okay. If you have a signal that's just a little too hot or a little noisy, it will catch a lot of that kind of stuff, but it doesn't clamp down immediately like some of these more contemporary noise gate circuits do. And using this specific pair of micro rack units, I almost always use this when the parametric EQ is engaged, just to lower the noise floor going into the amplifier when nothing else is happening. Of course, as soon as you start hitting your guitar, then whatever noise is going to stack up, and you might be able to hear a little bit of it in the background, but still, it's not too overwhelming. One of the issues you might run into though with this is you crank up the level high enough here, you can easily overload the input on the compressor. So the easiest way to maintain unity gain on these things is to put level up as high as you can get it until this starts clipping, and then back it back down. And then you have up to 14 dB of boost available on the output of this. So if you're going to use them in tandem, that's the way I would suggest to. But if you only have like the parametric EQ driving your amplifier, that's not nearly as big of a concern. So that about wraps it for today's Gear Curiosities. These have been quite a bit of fun. I think they're a very fitting addition to my dry rack. I would like to experiment with some of the other modules they make, especially like the stereo delay, reverb, that kind of stuff's right up my alley. The CE2 is a little redundant considering I have the MD500 pedal, so probably wouldn't be too interested in that. And I would like to try the distortion at some point, but that is for another rack, another project, and another day. Though I do hear some rumors that one of our Australian friends might have acquired one or two from this series as well. So be sure to check him out whenever that video eventually arrives. Might be before this one. That guy's a workhorse. So any other questions or comments, as always, please leave them down below. Thank you so very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.